Welcome to Lecture 20 in Anthropology. We will be taking a look at gender in ancient Egypt. This will begin our week-long look at the status of men and women and the implications that has for economic, political, social power, as well as implications for sexuality in ancient Egypt. Gender is one of those words that we use a lot in everyday language. And it's probably helpful if we have an agreed upon definition of exactly what constitutes gender. Gender is everything we associate, believe, and characterize based on the body of a human being to be their identity, their characteristic. So gender is a set of beliefs that we attach to the physical nature of a human being. So we look at a person, we go, you have these physical characteristics. This is your gender that results from that. Gender is constructed, and it's socially constructed based on these physical attributes. But it doesn't have to be any necessary connection for the physical body to result in any particular kind of gender identity. There is no natural logical connection between the body as it exists physically and any gender role assigned to it. If you engage in believing that, that's an example of the is-ought fallacy. The belief that if something is, therefore it ought to be. And it's just not the case that the human body exists in a way that results in perfectly define gender roles that are consistent through all history, all time. Consider, for example, assuming that just because someone might have breasts, that they would be nurturing or motherly. And that is not necessarily the case. The body doesn't predict the gender role or the gender identity. So keep in mind, gender is constructed. It's a cultural construct that we built up over thousands of years, but every society might do that cultural construct differently. Typically in American and European settings, gender is assumed to be binary. That is, most people assume there's a male category and a female category because they say there's a male body and a female body. But gender is much more complicated than that. And binary systems are not always the cultural system of every culture on Earth. In the last 50 years, scholars, particularly in the Western countries, Europe and the United States, have explored the idea of gender being a cultural construct. And if it's a cultural construct, then it's not necessarily going to be exclusively binary. We can't just assume that the only options out there are male or female. So, for example, we've come to increasingly recognize transgender folks who have inside of them an idea of who they are, but it doesn't match what they were assigned at birth. So when somebody looked at them at birth and said, well, physically you look like male, that person experiences a disconnect in their brain between that identification and who they really think they are. If you feel like you identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth, you're referred to as cisgender. Cis just means on the same side as. Trans means across. Non-binary is someone who does not accept that you have to be either male or female. You don't have to identify on either side of the gender binary. Gender fluid means that your identity can change over time and move from one end of the spectrum to another. And genderqueer is someone who says that their identity falls on the spectrum between male and female. There's even another category we could throw up here, and that category would be agender, in which someone feels like they don't have a gender at all. Since gender is a cultural construct, all of these identities are possible in societies that recognize them. The other thing that we should keep in mind is that gender is not the same thing as biological sex. The physical body parts that you have don't determine your gender identity. And in fact, there are lots of variations in the physical parts as well as the underlying genetics of your biological sex. So biological sex is not even just a male-female category. It's more complicated than that. Gender is also separate from sexuality. For most of history, people have assumed that gender and biological sex naturally correlated to one's sexual preferences. But that, of course, is not the case, as we recognize that identifying as male doesn't necessarily mean that you want to be with women. So the story is a lot more complicated for us in the modern world when it comes to gender. This makes it difficult anthropologically because we have to recognize that other societies, ancient societies especially, don't necessarily approach gender the same way we do. And so we might think in modern terms to be open to different ways of interpreting the evidence. But at the same time, we have to recognize that these ancient societies may have seen gender in limited ways, more limited ways than we do. In ancient Egypt, there's a clear set of characteristics for what's considered male and female. At least in art, it shows up pretty commonly that men are colored red, skin is red. They're shown being active, they're always doing something. They're shown in a much larger size than females. But we need not assume that red, large, active doesn't mean that they can't value beauty. For example, elite graves are often buried, you often find cosmetics in those graves. So clearly Egyptian standards of cleanliness and personal beauty applied to men. A more modern sort of take on that might be to say the Egyptian men were metrosexual, though the Egyptians would have never recognized that terminology. On the other hand, art and imagery of women suggests that they would be colored differently, so yellow, whitish color. It's definitely a lighter color than men. More passive roles for women, smaller size, often ridiculously smaller. Definitely shown as beautiful, especially if there's an elite drawing or an elite painting of a woman. Sometimes you do see women shown as wrinkled and elderly, but more often than not, if it's an elite depiction of a woman, she will be shown as the ideal standard of beauty. Egyptian women had quite a bit of power in their own right. Sometimes we see them called Nebet Per. Neb means lord, so Nebet is like female lord or lady, and Per is house, so the lady of the house, the mistress of the house. And Egyptian women could engage in business, buying and selling things, trading things. They could manage the household economy. They could be scribes and administrators, implying literacy there. It's rare, but it is possible. We see them in court, engaging in lawsuits, testifying, being active in legal affairs. Royal women, we know, held quite a bit of power in the household, sometimes ruling for their sons until their sons came of age. But we also note that royal women are usually depicted in terms of their linkage to the king. So you see them as mother of the king, great royal wife, um, not an identity in their own right, whatever power they might have had informally. We do know of at least one early Egyptian woman who was named a vizier. Lots of viziers could be named, and her name was Nebet, which interestingly is vizier lady, mistress vizier. Nebet was actually the mother-in-law of King Pepi the First of the Sixth Dynasty. So we don't know much about what was going on for this to be, the case for her. We don't know anything about her administrative ability, if she actually did anything or functioned in any way that was crucial to the Egyptian state. Um, we don't see another female vizier until about the 26th dynasty, so it's a relatively rare achievement. Lots of anthropologists and sociologists have argued that gender roles originally rose out of the sexual division of labor. We've talked about before sexual dimorphism, the idea that the species has differences in the physical bodies. Men are larger and faster and stronger, and therefore, with their greater body mass and strength, they were equipped for hunting, warfare, and clearing land. And that led to a belief somehow in men's overall greater power. So you can see here, this is an example of the is-ought fallacy. A man being stronger and bigger, well, we're going to give him more of a power in society, where the two things don't necessarily relate. But it seems clear that ancient societies in general followed this trend. Women, sexually dimorphically speaking, are associated with pregnancy. As far as we know, men can't do that. Breastfeeding and childcare, so that made them associated with the domestic scene, the home. And for some reason or other, those assumptions got translated into a setting of weaker or less power in society. In terms of Egypt, there's been an argument advanced by Fakhri Hassan, who said that the Egyptians were relatively gender equal before the rise of the state. That early Egyptian society did not have this strong trend of assuming women's subordinate, unequal status. But the creation of the state hardened gender roles by creating a sphere of male-dominated activity, state activity, where it was assumed this is what men do. They run the state. Haha, therefore, they deserve all this power. Other scholars have noted, too, that at the same time this is all happening, or a little bit before, the more that there is an intensive focus on agriculture rather than horticulture, women's status seems to decline. The assumption being that agriculture puts more power in the hands of men to produce the food needed for the society to be successful. And that lowered women's status because they're not seen as producing as much. These ideas have been advanced for Egypt. It's not entirely clear if the rise of the state has anything to do with it, but it may have certainly created an arena in which women were not seen as providing much of a role. Though we should keep in mind, too, that Egyptian women had quite a bit of power in the early Egyptian state, ruling for their children until their children came of age, and exercising perhaps some behind the scenes influence. Let's wrap up our look at concepts about gender with some of the great queens of ancient Egypt. And this is a bit of a prelude to one of the great queens that we'll be examining next. It's hard to say very much definitively about these women who took the throne or exercised a great deal of power in the court. One of the earliest is Neith-Hotep of the first dynasty, once thought to be the wife of Narmer. Now most scholars think that she was the wife of Hor-Aha, who likely built her an incredibly large tomb. When it was found, initially Egyptologists actually thought they were dealing with a pharaoh. They thought they were dealing with a king because of the impressive size of her monuments and the appearance of her name everywhere. Was she a ruler in her own right? It's hard to say that she specifically ruled, though she may have governed in the name of her child or exercised quite a bit of power behind the throne during her lifetime. We do find her name in a sarek, which is usually only reserved for kings. So it's kind of hard to interpret exactly why the Egyptians would have given her that honor if she wasn't exercising some kind of state power. Another later well-documented queen is Sobekneferu, and she is from the 12th dynasty. She ruled for nearly 4 years, something like 3 years and 10 months. She's actually pictured, the one pictured on the right, shown wearing the regalia of males, which we should probably be careful to assume that she's not portraying herself as a man. She's not denying her womanhood, but she's adopting the imagery associated with men, because if you are going to be on the throne, then you need to be seen as a man. You need to be seen in the same light as the men who have come before you. Keep that in mind as we take our next activity to be a look at a specific woman who did this. So I'll see you next time as we examine Hatshepsut.